Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and honoured guests, I want to talk to you tonight about stories. Now, unless you were supremely unfortunate when you were growing up, you will have had the pleasurable experience of having had some parental figure or some benevolent mentor read you a bedtime story, the better to smooth the passage to sleep and to give you a deep and refreshing time while you're far away with the fairies. Tonight, I want to talk to you about the value of a particular kind of story. I'm talking about fairy tales, fables, and myths. And generally speaking, when we're very small, such tales are told to us with the opening that is almost like an incantation, a spell, if you will, to put us in the proper mood. In English, it's once upon a time, in fact very closely paralleled in the Greek, in Armenian it's garuchugar, there was or there was not, in fact very close to the Turkish, but in fact it is a very provocative kind of opening to an experience that we seem only fit to relegate to childhood. I take this very personally. I have always considered stories to be much more than mere entertainment, a pastime for those of us who have a little bit of leisure. In fact, for me, when I was growing up and faced, quite frankly, with a world that seemed inexplicable, tortuous, and frankly hostile, stories were my best friends, they were my companions, they were my escape, and they ushered me into a realm where the imagination was paramount and where I could really dream for myself a new and extraordinary life. And yet, how sad it was for me that once leaving the ivory tower of my university days and taking up my first job as a reporter on the staff of a small national newspaper, a very good newspaper I might add, I was rather perturbed to find that the assignments for the articles that were coming my way were things like potato farmers going on strike and the pros and cons of the Education Committee of the House debating whether we should have 2 periods of religious instructions as opposed to 1. In fact, it was not that such work covering such subjects was beneath me, far from it. It was merely that it was beyond me. I was aghast that a motley congregation of what, where, how, why, and when amounted to what I considered to be sacred, which is to say, stories. And yet, we do live in an age where the skills of the empiricists, the materialists, the scientists, without, of course, meaning no disrespect to anybody here who is engaged in such pursuits, they are the defining standard by which things are okay and which things are to be neglected, undesired, pushed to the side. Stories, especially stories of the kind I'm talking about, stories of the other realms and of our non-human origins, have been trivialized, banalized, yes, there is such a word, and in fact marginalized, set aside either for the literati who have lofty, high literature tastes, or put aside for those of us who are too pedestrian to have more important concerns. And so we celebrate the world of the senses, or even the non-fictive realm of the mind, and for every Harry Potter we have 50 Shades of Grey, for every Lord of the Rings we have the lofty, monolithic authority of the selfish gene and the God delusion. How then is it possible that an adult like myself should be addressing other adults and in fact arguing in favour of these kinds of stories? Well, I propose 3 arguments in its favour. Firstly, we live in an age of distraction. Just as the internet giveth, so the internet taketh away. And as much as we are grateful to be so ultra-connected to each other in this day and age, we are frankly awash with tweets and podcasts, texts and threads, comments and blogs, blog posts, and so on and so forth. It is in the realm of the fairy story, of the great adventures of the heroes of old, we find a simpler and yet rawly connected realm, where our senses are not the only guides, and our minds not the only arbiter of what is fitting for our experience. It is a hearkening back to a time where things were savage but alive with creativity. Secondly, we live in an age of profound disappointment. I would be the last person to argue that the wonderful achievements of science are to be pooh-poohed, or indeed that we are not to celebrate the magnificent technological advances that seem to be on the horizon or just round the corner. And yet it is quite obvious to all of us that we have failed in any kind of attaining of the lofty values of compassion, of honouring everybody just the same way, of serving people, of ensuring that wealth is equitably and equally dispersed. If we go back to the tales of old, we go back and connect to a time where there were lofty ideals of doing right by that shaping hand that called you to your fate, and by doing the best and holding yourself to account, even if it cost you. And lastly, I would argue that we live in an age of dissolution. It does not take a Washington policy wonk or a pundit from The Economist to tell us that we're in a time of great transition. What is coming up is a new order, and nothing is certain. The old tales, the fairy stories, the myths, and the fables of old tell us to navigate such time of transition with grace, and with a knowing that we are part not just of the present consciousness, but of something far, far greater. And the heavens reflected, for the stories of the heroes of old are written not just in what you see in the books, but in the stars. And so, we come to that liminal point with these stories, where our material desires and obligations, our fears and our limitations, meet the horizon line of our fantasies. There was, and there was not. And who's to say, perhaps, there may be again. Mr. Toastmaster.